The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of Margaret's modest two-story home in suburban Minneapolis, creating rivulets that distorted the amber streetlights outside. At 72, she sat in her favorite armchair, the one with the faded floral pattern that David always complained about, holding a cup of chamomile tea that had long gone cold. The house felt impossibly large now, filled with the echoes of a life lived in service to others. Margaret Chun Williams had spent 47 years as a high school mathematics teacher, waking before dawn to prepare lessons and staying late to tutor struggling students as a single mother since David was 3, when her husband abandoned them for a younger colleague. She had juggled parent-teacher conferences with her own son's baseball games, graded papers while cooking dinner, and saved every penny she could for David's future. "Mom, you don't understand how expensive things are now." David's voice cut through her memories like a blade. The conversation from 3 weeks ago still burned in her chest. He had been sitting right there on the couch, his designer suit pristine, his Rolex catching the light as he gestured dismissively. "I've got a mortgage in Adina, private school for the kids, car payments. Sarah's always complaining about needing a bigger house, and honestly, with you not working anymore, you're basically useless to us financially." Useless. The word had hit her like a physical blow. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. She had retired 6 months ago, looking forward to spending time with her grandchildren. Maybe finally taking that pottery class she'd always dreamed about. She had imagined Sunday dinners filled with laughter, helping with homework, being the grandmother she'd never had herself. Instead, David visited only when he needed money. His wife Sarah barely acknowledged her existence, too busy with her yoga classes and charity galas to spare time for David's boring mother. The grandchildren, 8-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Jake, were strangers to her, polite but distant, more interested in their iPads than in hearing stories about their grandfather they'd never met, or learning about their Chinese heritage. From Margaret's mother's side, the doorbell's gentle chime interrupted her brooding. Margaret glanced at the clock. 8:30 p.m. Who would visit at this hour? She made her way to the front door, her arthritis making each step deliberate, and peered through the peephole. Robert Martinez stood on her porch, his gray hair damp from the rain, holding a covered casserole dish. At 68, he was 4 years her junior, a retired firefighter who had moved in next door 2 years ago after his wife passed away from cancer. His weathered face showed genuine concern as he waited patiently in the drizzle. "Robert, what are you doing out in this weather?" Margaret asked as she opened the door, immediately struck by the warmth in his brown eyes. "I made too much beef stew again," he said with a self-deprecating smile, holding up the dish. "Thought you might like some. I know it's been a rough few weeks since your son's last visit." Margaret felt her throat tighten. Robert had been in his garden when David had stormed out of her house that day, slamming the car door so hard it echoed down the quiet street. She hadn't told Robert what happened, but somehow he seemed to understand that she was hurting. "That's very kind of you," she managed, stepping aside to let him in. "Would you like some coffee? I was just about to make a fresh pot." "Only if it's not too much trouble," Robert replied, slipping off his wet jacket. "I brought some of that sourdough bread from the farmer's market too. Figured we could make a proper meal of it." As Margaret bustled around the kitchen, she watched Robert settle comfortably at her dining table, his presence filling the lonely spaces in a way that felt natural and unforced. He didn't comment on the stack of unopened bills on the counter, or the family photos that still included David's graduation pictures and wedding photos. "Despite everything, you know," Robert said, accepting a steaming mug of coffee, "I was thinking about what you said last month about wanting to learn guitar. My daughter lives in Portland now, and she left her old acoustic here. Would you be interested in borrowing it?" Margaret paused, her own mug halfway to her lips. "You remembered that?" "Of course I remembered. You said it was something you always wanted to try but never had time for while you were teaching and raising David." The casual way he spoke her son's name, without judgment or the careful politeness that others used when they sensed family tension, made Margaret's eyes water. When was the last time someone had truly listened to her dreams, no matter how small? "I'm probably too old to start learning now," she said softly. "Nonsense," Robert replied firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades talking people off ledges, both literal and metaphorical. "My grandfather learned harmonica at 85. Drove my grandmother crazy with his practicing, but he loved every minute of it." As they shared the hearty stew and warm bread, Margaret found herself talking about things she hadn't spoken of in years. Her mother's immigration from Taiwan, the recipes she'd tried to teach David that he'd dismissed as too ethnic for his friends, her early dreams of becoming a concert pianist before life and responsibility redirected her path, the pottery studio downtown that she'd driven past countless times but never entered, Why haven't you taken that pottery class? Robert asked, genuinely curious. Margaret hesitated. The truth was complicated, part financial worry, part fear of starting something new at her age, and part something she couldn't quite name. David thinks it's a waste of money. He says I should be saving every penny for emergencies or for the grandchildren's college funds. Robert's expression darkened slightly. What do you think? The question was so simple, yet it struck Margaret as revolutionary. When was the last time someone had asked what she thought, what she wanted? I think, she said slowly, surprised by her own boldness. I think I've spent my entire life doing what other people thought was best. Maybe it's time I did something just for me. Robert smiled, and Margaret noticed how it transformed his entire face, erasing years and revealing the young firefighter who had probably charmed his late wife into falling in love with him. Now that sounds like a plan worth making. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside Margaret's dining room, something new was beginning to bloom. As Robert helped her clear the dishes, their comfortable conversation flowing around shared stories and gentle laughter, Margaret felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since retirement, she went to bed that night without the crushing weight of loneliness pressing down on her chest. In the morning, she decided she would drive to that pottery studio and sign up for classes. David's opinion on the matter could wait. 3 weeks later, Margaret's hands were covered in clay, her face flushed with concentration and joy, as she shaped what her instructor generously called a rustic bowl on the pottery wheel. The Riverside Art Studio had become her sanctuary, a bright, airy space filled with creative energy and the quiet satisfaction of making something beautiful with her own hands. Looking good? Margaret called out Alina, a 30-something graphic designer who had become an unexpected friend in the evening pottery class. That rim is really coming along nicely. Margaret smiled, wiping a streak of clay from her cheek. 6 weeks of classes had transformed not just her pottery skills, but something deeper within her. She stood straighter now, spoke with more confidence, and for the first time in decades, had plans that didn't revolve around other people's needs. The front door chimed as another student entered, but Margaret was too focused on her wheel to look up until Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. Isn't that your son? Margaret's hands stilled on the clay, causing her bowl to wobble dangerously. David stood in the doorway of the studio, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and anger that she recognized all too well. He was dressed in his usual expensive casual wear khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in a month. Mom, what are you doing here? David's voice carried across the studio, causing several other students to look up from their work. Margaret carefully lifted her hands from the clay, feeling the eyes of her classmates on her. I'm taking a pottery class, David, as you can see. We need to talk now. His tone was the same one he'd used as a teenager when he was about to demand something he thought he deserved. Margaret glanced around the studio, seeing Elena's encouraging nod and the supportive faces of her new friends. I'm in the middle of class. Can this wait until... No, it can't wait. David moved closer to her wheel, his voice dropping but still audible to everyone nearby. Sarah found out about this little hobby of yours, and she's not happy. Do you have any idea how much these classes cost? How much money you're wasting while we're struggling to make ends meet? The familiar guilt began to creep up Margaret's spine, but something Elena had said during their coffee break last week echoed in her mind. You can't set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Margaret took a deep breath and stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. David, I think we should discuss this at home. No, we're going to discuss this right here, right now. David's voice rose again. I did some checking, Mom. This place charges $200 for an 8-week session. $200. And then there's your little guitar lessons with the neighbor and God knows what other frivolous spending you're doing behind our backs. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but not from embarrassment this time. Behind your backs? This is my money, David. Money I saved from 4 years of teaching. Your money? David laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Mom, let's be realistic here. You're 72 years old. You're not getting any younger. And when you need care, who do you think is going to pay for it? Me, that's who. So yes, it is my money in a way. The studio had gone completely quiet except for the hum of the pottery wheels that were no longer being used. Margaret could feel the shock and disapproval radiating from her classmates, but all she could focus on was the casual cruelty in her son's voice. Artsy-fartsy nonsense, she repeated quietly. Come on, Mom, you're not going to become some great artist at your age. This is just ... I don't know. Some kind of midlife crisis or something. Sarah thinks you're doing all this to get attention, to make us feel guilty for not visiting more often. Something inside Margaret snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a door closing forever. I see, she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. "And what would Sarah suggest I do with my time instead?" David shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting this level of composure. "Well, you could help out more with the kids. Emma needs help with math, and Jake could use someone to drive him to soccer practice. Sarah's got her hands full with the charity auction committee. You want me to be your unpaid babysitter and chauffeur? I want you to be a grandmother. I want you to contribute something meaningful to this family instead of playing in the mud like a child." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but instead of crumbling, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: clarity. She looked around the studio at the faces of people who had welcomed her, encouraged her, celebrated her small victories in learning something new. Then she looked back at her son, this man she had raised and sacrificed for, who now stood before her, treating her creativity and joy as inconveniences to his own plans. "You know what, David? You're absolutely right about one thing. I am 72 years old and I'm not getting any younger." Margaret untied her apron with deliberate care. "Which means I don't have time to waste on people who see me as useful only when I'm serving their needs." David's expression shifted from anger to confusion. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Margaret said, gathering her purse and jacket, "that I'm done apologizing for living my life. I raised you, I supported you through college. I helped with your down payment, and I've been available whenever you needed me. But I will not spend whatever years I have left being made to feel guilty for finding joy in simple things." She walked toward the door, pausing only when David called after her. "Mom, where do you think you're going? We're not done talking about this." Margaret turned back, and for a moment David saw something in her eyes that reminded him of the woman who had worked 3 jobs to pay for his baseball equipment, who had sat up with him through every fever and nightmare, who had cheered louder than anyone else at his graduation. But this time, that fierce protectiveness was directed inward. "Yes, we are done," she said quietly. "We've been done for a long time. I just didn't realize it until now." As Margaret walked out into the crisp October evening, she heard Alina call after her, "See you next week, Margaret. Your bowl turned out beautiful." Behind her, she could hear David attempting to explain the situation to the other students, his voice taking on the smooth, professional tone he used with clients. But Margaret didn't look back. For the first time in her adult life, she was walking away from her son's disappointment, instead of toward it. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and her own quiet tears. Not tears of sadness, but of a release so profound it felt like learning to breathe again. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed Robert's kitchen light was on, and for a moment she considered knocking on his door. But tonight, she needed to sit with this new version of herself. This woman who had finally said no to being diminished. Margaret entered her house and went straight to her bedroom, where she opened the bottom drawer of her dresser and pulled out a manila folder she hadn't touched in years. Inside were the documents her lawyer had prepared when she'd first written her will, back when David was in college, and she'd believed they would always be a team. It was time for some changes. Winter arrived early in Minneapolis that year, blanketing Margaret's neighborhood in a pristine layer of snow that muffled sound and transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. It had been 2 months since the confrontation at the pottery studio, and Margaret's life had settled into a rhythm that surprised her with its richness. The doorbell rang at precisely 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, just as it had every weekend. For the past 6 weeks, Margaret smiled as she opened the door to find Robert standing there with 2 steaming cups of coffee from the local cafe and a canvas bag filled with art supplies slung over his shoulder. "Ready for another adventure?" he asked, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Always," Margaret replied, accepting her coffee gratefully. She had learned that Robert was a man of quiet traditions, and their Saturday morning painting sessions in her sunroom had become something she looked forward to all week. As they settled into their makeshift art studio, Robert had helped her transform the sunroom into a creative space with proper lighting and easels. Margaret found herself marveling at how different her life had become. The pottery classes had led to watercolor painting, which had led to joining a book club, which had led to volunteering at the community center's literacy program. Each new activity had introduced her to people who saw her as Margaret the person, not Margaret the mother or Margaret the retired teacher, but simply Margaret. "How's the portrait coming along?" Robert asked, setting up his own easel beside hers. Margaret glanced at the canvas she'd been working on for 3 weeks, a painting of her mother, recreated from an old photograph taken shortly after her immigration to America. Her mother stood in front of their first apartment, wearing her best dress and an expression of determined hope that Margaret was only now beginning to understand. "I think I'm finally getting her eyes right," Margaret said, mixing a delicate shade of brown on her palette. She had this way of looking at the world like she was seeing all its possibilities at once. Robert studied the portrait with the serious attention he gave to all her work. She looks like a woman who didn't let other people define her limitations. The observation hit closer to home than Robert probably realized. Margaret had been thinking a lot about her mother lately, particularly about the stories she'd never shared with David, stories of courage and reinvention that suddenly felt relevant to her own life. Robert, Margaret said, adding a careful highlight to her mother's cheekbone, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "After Maria died, when you moved here, did you ever feel like you were betraying her memory by building a new life?" Robert's brush paused mid-stroke. He was working on a landscape of the frozen lake they'd visited last weekend, but Margaret could see him considering her question with the same careful attention he gave to mixing the perfect shade of winter blue. "Every day for the first year," he admitted. "I felt guilty for laughing at a neighbor's joke, for enjoying a good meal, for buying new curtains for the kitchen. It felt like being happy meant I was forgetting her." "What changed?" Robert set down his brush and looked directly at Margaret. "I realized that Maria didn't fall in love with me because I was miserable. She loved me because I was fully alive. Honoring her memory didn't mean stopping living it, meant living with the same joy and curiosity that she'd loved about me in the first place." Margaret nodded, understanding flooding through her. "David used to love how I sang while I cooked dinner. He'd sit at the kitchen table doing homework, and sometimes he'd join in, especially if I was singing one of those old Beatles songs. But when I sang a Taiwanese lullaby my mother taught me, he'd get embarrassed and ask me to stop, and you stopped singing them. I stopped singing altogether. Eventually, it seemed easier than navigating what was acceptable and what wasn't." Robert picked up his brush again, but his focus remained on Margaret. "When's the last time you sang in your kitchen?" The question startled her with its simplicity. I don't remember. Maybe it's time to start again." Their conversation was interrupted by the harsh sound of Margaret's doorbell, followed immediately by aggressive knocking. Margaret's stomach dropped as she recognized the pattern. David's impatient summons when he wanted something and expected immediate attention. "I should get that," she said, but Robert was already standing. "Would you like me to answer it?" Margaret considered the offer. 2 months ago, she would have been horrified at the thought of Robert confronting David on her behalf. Now, the idea was tempting, but she realized she needed to handle this herself. "Thank you, but I think this is something I need to do." David stood on her porch in his expensive winter coat, his face red from cold and anger. Behind him, Sarah sat in their BMW, with the engine running, her expression visible through the windshield as a mask of barely contained irritation. "Mom, we need to talk right now." "Hello, David," Margaret said calmly. "I'm in the middle of something. Could you call first next time?" "Call first." David pushed past her into the hallway. "This is serious, Mom. Sarah found out you've been volunteering at that community center, teaching English to immigrants or something. What the hell are you thinking?" Margaret closed the door carefully, buying herself a moment to center her thoughts. "I'm thinking that I have skills and experience. That can help people. The literacy program is very rewarding." "Rewarding?" David's voice cracked with disbelief. "Mom, these people could be anyone. They could be criminals, terrorists, God knows what. And you're just opening your home to them, telling them your personal business?" "I'm not opening my home to anyone, David. I work at the community center 2 afternoons a week helping adults improve their English skills. It's a supervised program run by the county. It's dangerous and irresponsible, and I want you to stop immediately." Margaret felt the familiar tug of old patterns, the ingrained response to smooth over David's anger with compliance. But then she heard the soft sound of Robert moving around in the sunroom, probably continuing to paint while giving her privacy to handle the situation. She thought of Alina from pottery class, who had texted her just yesterday to share news. Of a gallery showing, she thought of Mrs. Chun, no relation, despite the shared surname, a 78-year-old grandmother in her literacy class who was learning English so she could read bedtime stories to her American-born great-grandchildren. "No," Margaret said simply. David blinked. "What?" "I said no. I won't stop volunteering. I won't stop taking art classes. I won't stop living my life according to your fears and prejudices." "Prejudices." David's voice rose to a pitch that reminded Margaret of his teenage tantrums. "It's not prejudice to want my mother to be safe. It's not prejudice to expect you to act your age." "And what age is that, David? The age where I become invisible? The age where I stop learning, stop growing, stop contributing anything meaningful to the world beyond what you deem acceptable?" David opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret wasn't finished. "For the past 2 months, I've been happier than I've been in years. I've made friends, learned new skills, and helped other people learn something that will improve their lives. I've discovered that at 72, I still have things to offer the world. But every time you come here, you make me feel like a burden." Like someone whose dreams and interests are inconvenient problems for you to solve? That's not. David started, but Margaret held up her hand. I raised you to be better than this. David, I raised you to see people as individuals worthy of respect, not threats to be avoided. I raised you to value learning and growth and compassion. When did you become so afraid of anything different from your own narrow experience? David's face had gone from red to pale, and for a moment, Margaret saw glimpses of the boy he used to be, uncertain and defensive when confronted with his own behavior, but the moment passed and his expression hardened into the entitled mask she'd come to know too well. You know what, Mom? Fine. Waste your money on art classes and volunteer work. Hang out with whoever you want. But don't expect me to bail you out when it all goes wrong. Don't expect me to take care of you when you're broke and alone because you threw away your security on selfish whims. Margaret felt something cold and final settle in her chest. I don't expect anything from you anymore. David, that's the problem. I've spent so long expecting nothing that I forgot I deserved something. David stared at her for a long moment, clearly struggling to process this version of his mother, woman who refused to be diminished by his disapproval. Finally, he turned toward the door. Don't say I didn't warn you, he said over his shoulder. When you're sitting alone in some state-run nursing home because you've spent all your money on hobbies, remember this conversation? After he left, Margaret stood in her hallway for several minutes, listening to the BMW's engine fade into the distance. Then she walked back to the sunroom where Robert was carefully cleaning his brushes. Everything okay? He asked gently. Margaret looked at her mother's portrait, still unfinished on the easel. Her mother's painted eyes seemed to look back at her with approval, with the recognition of one woman who had chosen her own path to another. Yes, Margaret said, surprising herself, with how true it felt. Everything is exactly as it should be. That afternoon, she called her lawyer. Spring came to Minneapolis with the gentle persistence of someone who had learned patience through long winters. Margaret's garden, which she had neglected for years while focusing all her energy on David's needs, burst into bloom with daffodils and tulips she didn't remember planting. As she knelt among the emerging flowers, her hands deep in the rich earth, she realized they must have been a gift from Robert, planted secretly last fall when she wasn't looking. It had been 3 months since her last conversation with David. 3 months of silence that had initially felt like a wound but had gradually transformed into something closer to peace. Her life had expanded to fill the space that worry and disappointment had once occupied. The literacy program had asked her to coordinate a new conversation group for advanced students. Her pottery had improved enough that Alina was encouraging her to participate in the summer arts fair. Most surprisingly, she had started singing again, not just in the kitchen, but in the community center choir that Robert had convinced her to join. The doorbell's chime drew her attention away from the garden. Margaret wiped her hands on her jeans, another small rebellion. As David had always criticized her for dressing like a teenager when she wore casual clothes, and went to answer it. Emma and Jake stood on her porch, looking smaller and more uncertain than she remembered. Emma, now 9, clutched a homemade card in her hands while 10-year-old Jake shifted nervously from foot to foot. Grandma, Margaret? Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. We made you something. Margaret's heart stuttered. She hadn't seen her grandchildren since before the pottery studio confrontation, hadn't spoken to them except for brief, awkward phone calls on their birthdays. She knelt down to their eye level, noting the way they seemed to brace themselves, as if expecting rejection. Double quotes. Hello, sweethearts. What brings you by? Mom dropped us off, Jake said, gesturing toward the street where Sarah's car was already disappearing around the corner. She said we could visit for an hour while she runs errands. An hour. Margaret bit back her first response that an hour wasn't nearly enough time to repair months of absence, that grandchildren shouldn't be dropped off like inconvenient packages. Instead, she smiled and opened her door wider. Well then, we'd better make it a good hour. Would you like to see my art studio? Emma's eyes widened. You have an art studio? I do indeed. Mr. Robert helped me set it up in the sunroom. We've been painting together on weekends. As Margaret led them through the house, she noticed how the children looked around with new curiosity, as if seeing the space for the first time. They paused at the piano, which Margaret had recently tuned and where sheet music now sat openly. Instead of hidden away in the bench, do you play piano, Grandma? Jake asked, running his fingers lightly across the keys. I used to, a long time ago. I've been thinking about starting again. In the sunroom, Emma and Jake stared in amazement at the easels, the carefully organized art supplies, and the paintings that covered nearly every available surface. Margaret's portrait of her mother was finished now, hanging in a place of honor. Next to Robert's latest landscape, you painted all of these, Emma asked, moving closer to examine a watercolor of the lake in winter. With a lot of help and practice, yes. Would you like to try? I have extra canvases. For the next 45 minutes, Margaret watched her grandchildren discover the joy of creating something from nothing. Jake proved surprisingly adept at mixing colors, while Emma showed an intuitive understanding of composition that reminded Margaret of her own mother's artistic eye. They chattered as they painted, telling her about school, their friends, their soccer games, details of their lives that David and Sarah had never shared. "Grandma," Emma said as she added careful highlights to her painting of their house, "why don't you come to my soccer games anymore?" The question was asked with a child's directness, but Margaret heard the hurt underneath it. "Did you want me to come?" "Yes. Tommy's grandpa comes to all his games, and he's really loud when Tommy scores. I wanted you to be loud when I scored, too." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I would love to come to your games, Emma. I didn't know you wanted me there." "Mom said you were too busy with your hobbies to spend time with us," Jake said matter-of-factly, focused on his painting. "But Dad said your hobbies were stupid, and you should spend more time with family instead." The casual revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her grandchildren had been caught in the middle of their parents' judgment, told contradictory stories that left them confused about their grandmother's priorities. Jake, Emma, Margaret said carefully, "What if I told you that both of those things could be true? That I can love my hobbies and love spending time with you?" Emma looked up from her painting. "Like how I love reading and playing soccer." "Exactly like that? Could you teach us to paint?" Jake asked. "I mean, if we came over more often? I would love nothing more than to teach you to paint. And to play piano if you're interested. And to cook some of the recipes my mother taught me. If you'd like to learn about that part of your family history." The children exchanged glances, some wordless communication passing between them. "We heard Mom and Dad talking about you," Emma said quietly. "They said you changed and that you don't care about family anymore." Margaret set down her own brush and moved to sit between them on the small couch Robert had helped her move into, the sunroom. "Can I tell you something important? Sometimes adults say things when they're hurt or angry that aren't really true. I love you both more than I can possibly explain. I think about you every day. But I also learned something important recently, that loving people doesn't mean you have to give up everything that makes you happy." "Like how you still love us, even though you like painting?" Jake asked. "Exactly. And how you can love Mom and Dad, even when you disagree with them about something." Emma leaned against Margaret's side, and Margaret felt her heart expand in a way that had nothing to do with obligation or duty, and everything to do with simple, uncomplicated love. "Grandma, could you come to my game next Saturday?" "It's at 10 in the morning. I'll be there," Margaret promised. "And I'll be appropriately loud when you score." When Sarah returned to pick up the children, she barely acknowledged Margaret, clearly uncomfortable with how enthusiastic Emma and Jake were about their visit. But as they piled into the car, Emma rolled down her window. "Don't forget Saturday," she called. "I won't forget," Margaret called back, waving until the car disappeared around the corner. That evening, Margaret sat in her lawyer's office for the second time in 6 months. The updated will spread out on the desk between them. Thomas Brennan had been her attorney for 15 years, had handled her divorce, her house purchase, and David's college fund. He was a kind man in his 60s who had watched Margaret navigate single motherhood with the steady competence that had defined most of her adult life. "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" Thomas asked gently. "It's a significant change." Margaret looked at the document that would leave the bulk of her estate, her house, her savings, her retirement accounts, to Robert Martinez, with smaller bequests to the literacy program, the arts center, and a college fund for Emma and Jake, that their parents couldn't touch until the children turned 25. David would receive a single dollar and a letter she had written and rewritten dozens of times. "I'm sure," she said. "I've thought about this for months. Robert has shown me more kindness and respect in 2 years than David has in the past decade. This isn't about punishment, it's about recognizing the people who have actually been family to me." Thomas nodded and made a note on the document. "And you're comfortable with the trust structure for the grandchildren?" "Yes, I want them to have opportunities, but I want them to earn their education through their own efforts, not their parents' expectations." As Margaret signed her name to the final page, she felt no sadness, no doubt, only a profound sense of completion. She had spent her entire adult life building a legacy she thought David would appreciate, only to learn that he saw her efforts as transactions with predetermined repayment schedules. Walking out of the lawyer's office into the warm spring evening, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. She had dinner plans with Robert. They were going to try the new Thai restaurant downtown, and tomorrow she would start preparing for Emma's soccer game. Maybe make a sign to hold up when her granddaughter scored. Her phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, her heart jumped, hoping it might be David. That somehow the afternoon with the children had prompted him to reach out. Instead, it was Alina from pottery class. Gallery accepted 3 of your pieces for the summer show. You're going to be a published artist, drinks to celebrate? Margaret smiled and typed back. Absolutely. I have so much to celebrate. As she drove home through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, Margaret reflected on the strange alchemy of loss and gain that had defined this year of her life. She had lost her son's approval, his presence, the future she had imagined. They would share, but she had gained something she hadn't even known she was missing herself. At 72, Margaret Chun Williams was finally learning what it meant to be truly alive. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after her confrontation with David at the pottery studio, Margaret died peacefully in her sleep. Robert found her when she failed to answer his morning knock, looking serene in her bed with a half-finished letter to her grandchildren on the nightstand beside her. The funeral was small but filled with love. Robert spoke about her courage in reinventing herself late in life. Alina displayed some of Margaret's pottery and paintings. Mrs. Chen from the literacy program read a poem in English that she had written in Margaret's honor. Emma and Jake, now 10 and 11, sang a song they had learned from their grandmother, a Taiwanese lullaby that Margaret had finally taught them during their weekly art sessions. David attended the service but sat in the back, his face unreadable. When the will was read, his shock was complete and devastating. In the letter Margaret had left for him, she wrote, "My dear David, I hope someday you will understand that love is not something you earn through usefulness or lose through independence. I loved you from the moment you were born until the moment I drew my last breath, but I refused to continue loving you at the expense of loving myself. Robert showed me what it meant to be valued for who I am, not what I can provide. He listened to my dreams, encouraged my growth, and celebrated my victories without asking what was in it for him. He was the family I chose. Just as you chose to see me as a burden rather than a blessing, I have left you $1, not as cruelty, but as a symbol. It represents the exact value you placed on my happiness, my interests, and my right to live fully in whatever years I had left. I pray that Emma and Jake will grow up to understand that loving someone means wanting them to flourish, not just serve. The money I've set aside for their education comes with the hope that they will learn to see the world with curiosity and compassion, qualities I tried to teach you but that you chose to abandon. I died happy. David, I died surrounded by evidence of a life fully lived, not just endured. I hope someday you'll understand what a gift that was, and what a waste it is that you chose not to share it with me. With love and forgiveness." Mom David crumpled the letter in his hands, his composure finally breaking as the full weight of his loss hit him, not just the inheritance, but the years of connection he had thrown away through his own selfishness and narrow vision of what his mother's life should be. Sarah, who had expected a substantial windfall to solve their financial pressures, was furious. "This is insane. We'll contest it." She wasn't in her right mind, all those art classes and volunteering. It was clearly some kind of breakdown. But Thomas Brennan had anticipated this reaction. Margaret had been thoroughly evaluated by a psychiatrist before signing the final will, and her mental competency was well documented. The will would stand. Robert, overwhelmed by Margaret's unexpected gift, used the inheritance exactly as she would have hoped. He established a scholarship fund for single mothers pursuing education, donated significantly to the literacy program and art center, and kept Margaret's house as a tribute to her memory, maintaining her garden, her art studio, and the piano she had never quite found time to play again every weekend. Emma and Jake visited Robert at what they still called Grandma's house. He taught them to paint, helped them tend the garden, and made sure they never forgot the woman who had shown them that love meant encouraging someone to become their best self, not their most convenient self. Years later, when Emma graduated, as valedictorian of her high school class, she would dedicate her speech to my grandmother, who taught me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Jake, who became a social worker specializing in immigrant services, would keep Margaret's portrait of her mother in his office as a reminder of the courage it takes to build a new life. David eventually came to understand what he had lost, though the realization came too late for reconciliation. On quiet evenings when his own children seemed distant and focused on their own lives, he would remember his mother's singing voice in the kitchen, her patient help with homework, her unwavering presence at every school event that mattered to him. He would remember her excitement about pottery class, about painting, about the simple joy of learning something new, and he would finally understand that he had mistaken her growth for abandonment, her self-discovery for selfishness. Story became legend in her neighborhood, in her art classes, in the community center where she had volunteered. It was the story of a woman who refused to accept that her value lay only in her usefulness to others, who chose dignity over convenience, authenticity over approval. Most importantly, it was the story of someone who proved that it's never too late to reclaim your own life, even if it means disappointing the people who never truly saw you to begin with. In the end, Margaret Chun Williams got exactly what she had always deserved: a life lived on her own terms, surrounded by people who celebrated rather than diminished her, and a legacy built not on sacrifice and servitude, but on the radical act of choosing joy. Her final act wasn't revenge. It was revolution, a quiet, dignified revolution that said, "I matter. My dreams matter. My happiness matters. And I will not apologize for finally believing that truth." The neighbor who inherited everything wasn't just receiving money and property, he was receiving the ultimate validation of Margaret's philosophy that family is what you build, not just what you're born into. Love is what you nurture, not what you demand. And worth is something you recognize in yourself first, before anyone else can see it. Margaret's fortune went to the man who had seen her fortune all along, not her bank account, but her spirit, her creativity, her capacity for growth and joy at any age. In the end, that was the greatest gift she could have given, proof that being useful to others means nothing if you've forgotten how to be valuable to yourself. Margaret's legacy lived on not in the money she left behind, but in the lesson she taught through her final years: that dignity, creativity, and self-respect are not luxuries reserved for the young or the wealthy. They are birthrights that we can claim at any age, as long as we have the courage to believe we deserve them.